And thank you also to our special guest. So yeah, I'm sure doesn't really need much of introduction, but we've got Michael Brito with us today, who's the global head of data and intelligence at Zeno Group, and digital OG. I've seen written quite a few places online, which I think is probably a fair description. And yeah, someone with like a great track record, great pioneering record of like working in social and audience data. And then we're pairing him up with our own Francesco D'Orazio. So Fran is co-founder of Pulsar, and also as throughout academia and business and the foundation of several companies, been inventing tools that try and help us like understand the world around
I'm
us.
old. I'm old. You don't need to.
Well,
you forgot to mention that Fran has great hair too. He really does. Yeah.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
yeah. I had a whole paragraph on the hair, but I'll just drop it now. We don't need that, Suze. But yeah, I mean, so these are obviously our speakers. I guess what we're here to talk about today is narrative intelligence, and it's the first in a new series. So this isn't just a one-off. This is the first episode, and we'll be talking to like different experts from different businesses, different practitioners, people around the world to kind of bring together like what some of the sharpest minds are saying and thinking about this emerging category. And maybe we'll get started straight away, and maybe I'll launch it straight to you, Michael, and sort of ask, when you hear that term, narrative intelligence, like what does that mean to you?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And by the way, I appreciate Pulsar for inviting me. And Fran, it's always good to see you as well, my friend. I think it's, when we first started talking about this, I felt that there was kind of a need to kind of stress to practitioners and brands and businesses that, we've kind of moved on from this social listening era. It's still important, and there are tools that position themselves as listening to social media conversations. And, but I think it kind of, when we talk about social listening or monitoring of the media, it really, it doesn't justify the actual work, right? Because when I hear the word social listening, it's like, okay, there were 10,000 mentions of my brand, or our share of voice is increasing or decreasing. And I've always been of the mindset that it kind of reduces the work to being very tactical. And I think it very much was in the early days, with when you had early companies like Radian 6 and and several others in the early 2000s. That was the type of insights that you needed. But I think that in today's world, where everything's polarizing and brands are being canceled, and also the idea of cultural intelligence and understanding how to insert brands into kind of relevant cultural moments, I think it really up levels the actual work that people like myself have done traditionally for years, Fran, as well as you. And so the idea of narrative intelligence, I think, just takes the work that we're already doing and makes it more strategic. And it makes it, to the point where we can walk into a boardroom or walk into the CCO's office to say, yeah, there were 15,000 mentions, but we see kind of a narrative brewing up about our CEO or about one of our products, and that's something that you traditionally wouldn't see if you're just counting numbers and counting mentions. And so to me, narrative intelligence is a way to kind of understand the themes and the topics and narratives that are emerging outside of general social listening and monitoring. And what you do with those is really dependent upon the scope of work, right? In some cases, it could be crisis. So you're looking for narratives that you need to prepare for, and maybe do some risk mitigation. Or on the proactive side, it's culture, right? How do we insert ourselves into very relevant culture conversations? I'm thinking like the Oreo tweet of like 2013, right? That was like the very first real-time marketing moment. And it doesn't really justify narrative intelligence, but it's the idea of brands listening and being able to activate in real time based on what the opportunity is. And so, narrative intelligence, cultural intelligence is kind of the same thing depending upon how you look at it. And so I think that people who are working in social listening should not refer to it as social listening anymore. It really, again, I think it needs to be brought to the boardroom or to the executive table to say, this is a strategic opportunity for us to, again, understand the kind of the narratives that are driving our business up or down, as well as cultural proactive marketing moments. That's my initial take on it. And but
I
Fran, I
mean,
would love your thoughts too.
obviously, I wanted you to be on this conversation because I knew that you would have something interesting to say that I always really agree with. And for me, if I look back on my career up to this point, the biggest kind of like frustration of it is that it's been defined by a term that I think doesn't do justice to the value that is in the work that we do. And the problem is that we are looking at these data that we take from social media and from any other customer interaction or like people interaction online. And we're kind of like treating that in the most simplistic possible way, extracting things like sentiment or extracting things like word frequencies. And to me, there's so much more in there. And what that points to in terms of value is the behavioral power of that data and trying to understand what kind of behaviors can I predict about the audience using this data, because that's probably the rawest signal we get on a mass scale from the audience. And so for me, narratives have always been a proxy to try and unearth the beliefs that people have, because if you identify the beliefs, you can then predict how someone will behave. And that for me is the sequence. It's like identify the beliefs so that you can understand the behavior whenever it happens, and you're trying to justify it if it happened in the past, or you're trying to predict the behavior when it happens in the future. So for me, the narrative is just the way of getting to the belief. And so when we were looking at this data, we thought like, how can we get to the belief without people saying it explicitly? Sometimes people will say it explicitly. Sometimes it's just a collection of signals that point in a similar direction that points to the belief. And for me, narratives are the best way to try and get to the beliefs. And that's why we start investing heavily on this.
It's interesting because, you know, in full transparency, I do have access to your narrative tool, and it's fascinating because when I look at certain narratives that the media is publishing about a particular topic or something in the news versus the discourse that's happening on social media, and you look at the narratives and you compare them side by side, a lot of times they're very different. And some, you know, traditionally, you know, when I've talked to practitioners who are social listening practitioners, they don't analyze the media. So a lot of people that I know who work internally, they're looking at, you know, X and TikTok and Reddit and things like that, and those are great, but they leave, you know, the responsibility of understanding how the media is framing narratives and brands and products and services isn't really part of the scope. And I think it really should be, because sometimes you have the media that's driving narratives that is then echoed by the community in social. Sometimes it's the reverse, but in many times, in almost all cases, you're going to find narratives that don't exist in social that exist in the media, and vice versa. And to me, that is intelligence. That is intelligence that brands need to know, especially if they're working in some type of communications role, or even just social media. That's a communications role too, right? You're pushing marketing messages out there, and so I think it's, again, you're right. Social listening doesn't do what we do justice. In fact, it makes it appear very elementary in the types of insights that could be gleaned when looking at narratives the way that your platform does. Quite honestly.
I think, yeah, I think part of the problem is that this data, as I've realized that people are paying attention to this thing that I said like almost like 10 years ago, which is like qualitative data on a quantitative scale. And I left it there. And then like 10 years later, I think in Chicago, like a researcher from Brazil was on stage and it was like this caller said once, qualitative data on a quantitative scale. I was like, well, that's me. Hi, nice to meet you. And I was like, oh, okay. So it's like someone likes that idea. But I think the fact that the source data is qualitative and is on the scale that is quantitative has made it very difficult, until AI at least, to get to a synthesis that would make it really easy for people to see where the insight is. So you would have to be really good at machine learning and all sorts of like techniques for manipulating vast amounts of text data. I mean, images and video, forget about doing the same level of quality of analysis that you can do today with AI before AI, right?
Yeah.
But now with AI, we can actually synthesize multimodal inputs, text, images, and videos. And with the right structure, we can actually get to an output that is quite tangible for a non-technical person to understand. So that's what we wanted to do with narratives. We wanted to try and say, can we just break down the data in a way that gives us one outcome, the narrative, nothing else. I'm not looking at sentiment. I'm not looking at keyword frequencies and just looking at narratives. Let's break it down by that. Let's make it as easy as doing a keyword search in ChatGPT or doing a keyword search in a search engine, and just give people a list of narratives and let's see if they can do something with it. And that for me is the step one of kind of creating this category. And I think it's been fascinating to see how people have been reacting to that, because the first thing that I found really exciting about it from the feedback from actually one user that is going to be a guest of this series at some point is that she said, and I'm not going to reveal the name because I want to use this for like when we interview her, but she said that this was like having a vibe about something and turning that vibe into an insight. And I really like that idea that you have a vibe about something moving in society, an undercurrent, a perception, a trend, and then getting something that makes that vibe into an insight because it gives you some data behind it. And I thought, like, that's exactly what this is. It's taking the whole of culture that we can analyze and then helping you check whether the vibe that you have about something that might be happening is actually happening for real, and at what scale is it happening. And so that for me is the first job that this is trying to do. And then the next thing that I discovered is that beyond that initial feedback, a lot of people, unless they were like advanced and experienced like you in the space of narrative intelligence, they didn't know what to do with narratives. And it was like, okay, I've got that idea that there is this narrative that is like emerging from the media or is emerging from social in contrast to what we see in the media. That's interesting as well. What do I do with it now? You'd be surprised, but the vast majority of people don't know what to do with that information.
That's exactly right. I mean, to me, that is, there's innovation that could happen. There is content creation that could happen. I mean, one layer that I wasn't necessarily prepared to talk about is the large language models and their interpretation of narratives, right? Because now it's like, for years, your team and you are co-founded Pulsar. But for years in different tools, we've been analyzing the sentiment of the source data, right? That qualitative Reddit post or whatever it is. Now it's like when users are going to ChatGPT or Perplexity or whatever, and the way that the large language models are contextualizing that source content, what I'm finding is that it's either accurate and equal to that of the source content. They're making it either they're blowing it out of proportion, so they're amplifying it more than it should be, or in some cases they're not giving it the right. It should be a bigger issue than what the model is suggesting, and so it's just another element of narratives in. And it's interesting because I never in a million years thought I would say this, because we've been analyzing social media conversations from people, right, for years, and now it's like there's this layer of machines and their personas and their personalities, and all of them are different, and so. It's interesting just to see how that is evolving. One of the things I love, honestly, and just in full transparency, no one at Pulsar asked me to say this, but I'll be honest when I say it, is that what I love about the platform is the ability to track the narratives over time. Because that to me is probably more important in itself than the actual narrative, because it gives you an understanding of how the signals, right, that would cause a particular narrative that maybe went from the news to social, or from the social to the news, and then it turns into other kind of elements that you may, as a brand, may not have been prepared to kind of underscore. So tracking over time, I think, is critical. And I think that in some cases, the action item, to be honest, is just to sit and watch, right? There may not be an action for a brand, just to understand if something is declining, then you let it decline if it's negative. If it's positive, obviously there's or if it's negative and it's increasing, then obviously there are things that brands need to do from a PR crisis standpoint. But I just want to call that out because I think that, and looking at, a lot of the platforms and knowing the space really well, that kind of narrative evolution I think, is very unique to the platform. And I think, and I'm curious, when you were developing this, like, what was the thinking behind it? I know I don't want to turn this into an interview, but I think it's an interesting discussion point
No,
because I
no,
think that people should know.
no, it is. It's very useful to explore that, because the thinking there was narratives lead to specific outcomes. And if you are if you're an energy company being associated to a narrative about climate change, sooner or later is going to lead to a decline of your share price as an outcome, because the association with you and a narrative that is driving that kind of problematic, challenging context is going to make you, is going to expose you. And that exposure at some point is going to cause damage. So if you can link a narrative to an outcome, you can actually start planning some actions, as in what we always discuss with people is, as a brand manager, you want to be a manager of narratives. You want to manage the share of narratives that are positive for you and that lead to positive outcomes, and you want to manage down the share of narratives or narratives that have negative outcomes for you. And this is not sentiment. This is negative outcomes as in connected to a decrease in customers, a decrease in share price, a decrease in perceived social value of what you do, a decrease in reputation, anything that you're tracking. And so measuring how narratives evolve over time for us was, apart from being fascinating to be able to see, you know, the undercurrents of society and how they evolve over time and how the shape changes over time, it's fundamental to be able to understand whether you should be taking action or not, because the trajectories will tell you whether you should be paying attention to the problem or not. If the trajectory is flat, you obviously there isn't a lot for you to do. But if the trajectory is like decreasing or increasing, or is showing a trend in a certain direction that points to positive or negative outcomes, then it's quite clear that you need to act, and you need to bring in that framework of managing the share of narratives that you own. And so we started building that, and as we were building that ability to measure how narratives evolve over time, what became also quite important was the ability to connect narratives. So there are narratives that are like bringing with them a cluster of other narratives that are associated to the primal narrative that you're tracking. So, for example, there's a narrative now that is starting to emerge that is about the UK being in a downward spiral. Now, that narrative is connected to narratives about crime, but it's also connected to narratives about house prices. That's connected to narratives about the standing of Great Britain in Europe. So there's a bunch of narratives that are all connected together, and they all move in similar directions when they move. And the reason why this is really interesting is that when you are using narratives to understand beliefs, is because you are trying to understand how, as a brand, as an organization, can I enter a category. So if I'm trying to enter a category, I need to understand what beliefs exist in the category, so that I can either reinforce an existing belief or try and change a belief that exists. And so when I have to decide how to enter a category, what beliefs I tackle is quite important strategically as a decision in terms of where you invest your money. And you generally want to invest your money on the beliefs that carry other beliefs with them, so that you know that the biggest point of impact for you is going to then generate a cluster of beliefs to move in the direction that are interesting to you as an organization. So connecting narratives is really important because it gives us a graph of the beliefs system behind that narrative, and allows you as an organization to decide what is the best entry point for me to join this conversation and say something useful that is going to move the perception of my brand within this industry. And if you have that understanding, then strategically your plan is like 100 times stronger than if you're just looking at a specific narrative in isolation.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that. I mean, I almost feel like that leaders and other like SaaS providers need to think about the way that you explained, you know, how narratives, you know, when you map a narrative to an outcome, it's measurable, and it's not just sentiment, or it's not an increase in share of voice, you know, it's those metrics that we've been looking at for years. And I've always been, you know, honestly kind of annoyed with the market because, you know, we do a lot of, I'm not going to mention any names of any providers out there, because we're partners with many of them, and they do a lot of good. But when we look at like media monitoring platforms or even other social listening platforms where, you know, they have the obvious, you know, word clouds. I'm like, I swear, if I never had to look at a word cloud again, it would make me happy. Word clouds aren't useful at all, you know, and so yet I don't understand the why other leaders, similar to people like your peers, right, at competitors, why they're not thinking about this holistically and helping either marketing teams who are managing social media, or, you know, PR teams that are tracking media coverage, Because even the media monitoring outlets, all they do is count numbers, and it gives you zero context into what the media is actually saying. And it kind of irritates me because it just, from my perspective and managing a team of analysts and very smart people, we just use the tools to export the data, and we export that data and we upload it into an LLM to do topic modeling and cluster analysis, or some type of analysis that goes beyond just 1,500 mentions and UVMs that aren't a real, or impressions that aren't a real number. And so I don't know what your thoughts are on that. It just, but it bugs me because it makes I feel like it's a missed opportunity for many of these providers. And I realize though that they want to sell into the user who's not very technical, or the user that may just be wanting to count mentions and impression data. So I understand it's very easy to do that. You click a button, you type in your query, and you have somewhat of a report. But I've been pretty vocal in the past, on LinkedIn, and not without calling brands out or providers out. But I wonder if it's like also having to just educate the brands, and to want them to like expect more. Like they need to expect more from and the investments that they're making in social listening platforms or media monitoring platforms, because all they're getting is just very basic numbers, in my opinion.
I think part of the problem is lack of imagination, but part of the problem is also the lack of imagination, both on the part of the product people and tech that are building these solutions, and on the users. I know you should never blame the users. I'm not blaming anyone, but I'm saying users, especially when they haven't been doing this for the last 10, 15 years, they, play with what they're given, right? So they expect certain ways of like looking at the data, and they expect that way of analyzing the data to be the only way that they can actually manipulate the data and get something out of it, unless they make that leap of faith that comes with confidence and creativity, and they think that they can do better with that. Very few people do that. So that's one problem, where like the tool makers are kind of like adapting to their lack of imagination and the lack of imagination of the users, and the loop creates a state of kind of like stale analysis, if you like.
Yeah.
I think LLMs are breaking that loop now, because they're introducing they're removing the friction that comes from being smart about analysis, and doing in the background a bunch of analysis that would require you to do a lot of coding to be able to do it with traditional tools in machine learning and traditional tools for analytics. So that's giving people a lot more imagination about what to expect. And so I'm very excited about how the users will evolve their behaviors based on, for example, using MCPs and being able to call tools like Pulsar from within ChatGPT or within Claude and ask questions of the data, rather than just worry about what kind of analysis to do. So that is going to generate a new wave of innovations in the space, because we're going to be able to move one layer above the data and just analyze the data based on the outcomes that we're analyzing. So narratives, for me, is one of the first products that abstracts from the data, and it gives you as a unit of analysis, not the tweet or the Instagram post, but the narrative. And that's a new concept in that space, because in that space, the best kind of abstraction you've had in the last 15 years from data, if you don't want to deal with specific posts and the engagement that they generate, the impressions and the sentiment, the next level up is a topic cluster, right? And that's fine, but the topic cluster itself is actually a very unambitious way of looking at the data, because you're still looking at clustering messages within a subset that you have created with your own Boolean. What we do in narrative intelligence is instead clustering the entire universe. And that's why I think a lot of people make this mistake of assuming that narrative analysis, narrative detection is about clustering, and it's like topic clustering. It's not topic clustering. It's saying, I'm taking every single post that comes out of X, every single news article that comes out from the media globally, and I'm going to cluster them by narratives, like systems of concepts that evolve over time in correlation. And if I do that, then I also solve one of the problem, which is the one that you mentioned before, which is that LLMs are gonna overemphasize specific angles, and I'm going to give you overinflated importance to a specific detail that comes from just one person. So what we're trying to do is saying we're going to use this incredible signal from humans to tell you what the seeds of the zeitgeist are. There are like these seeds out there that point to some beliefs that people have. Then, because we analyze the whole thing, we can tell you how relatively important these beliefs are to each other. Because I know that out of like everything that has been published in the news today, there's like maybe 50,000 narratives globally. And I can see how each one of those is larger or smaller than the other 50,000 that are in the data set. So then I have a relative sense of importance for those narratives. And then I can go to an LLM and say, now enrich this narrative. Tell me everything you know about this narrative. And that's when LLMs become amazing. So I've given the discovery signal role to the humans that are giving me that sense because they're producing the news, they're producing the social media content. I then get a sense of importance by how much the humans are focusing or talking about that specific problem. So I get a relative kind of like ranking of like who's important and who's not in that list of narratives. But then I use the vast knowledge that the LLMs have computed in their models to append all the papers, all the PDFs, all the studies that have been done by other people. And that becomes quite incredible, actually, to see how much you can expand the knowledge of a narrative by using an LLM if you go in with a weighted input, like a narrative that is measured in relation to all the other narratives that exist.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something
That's a great explanation.
we're releasing that soon, actually. That's we've been testing it today. It's going to change completely how rich a narrative is. You get a summary and a title, but you also get where does the narrative come from, which audiences are behind it, what are the outcomes of these narratives, what beliefs are behind these narratives, what cultural trends are connected to these narratives. And then you realize how powerful LLMs are if you give it the right input.
So I'm just curious because a couple of years, well, maybe like a year ago, someone had asked me when ChatGPT started getting a lot of media attention. This was about 6, 7 months after they released, the consumer product. Initially I had thought when I think there was a new capability around the uploading files, right? So we started testing uploading data sets into it and analyzing it that way. And somebody asked me if I thought that this would be the demise of social listening platforms. But it sounds like what you just mentioned, users being able to connect through to Pulsar through an MCP, that you're anticipating that many of your customers won't necessarily be logging into the platform. Instead, they'll be accessing it from a local their own kind of chat GPT or custom GPT that's connected to Pulsar in the back end. Is that what you think the future is going to be? I honestly, I'm curious what you think because I'm not really sure. I kind of go both ways.
I have had this conversation a few times. It depends on what job you're trying to do. So the chat interaction with data is very useful, but from a cognitive standpoint, it has a lot of drawbacks. And it points to some value, but it also points to some problems. And the way I explain it is interacting with data via because the dichotomy is between interacting with data through data visualizations in a way that represents data visually in front of you in a dashboard and allows you to query that dashboard and map it out from a spatial standpoint versus having an interaction with data through a chat interface where you're asking questions. And the difference between the two, and they're both valuable, but they're different. So the chat interface is like entering a cave with a flashlight on your helmet and just progressing down that cave. Now, as you're progressing down that cave, at one point you might have a junction and you might have to decide whether you go left or right. If you are in the cave with your helmet and your flashlight, unless you know exactly what the cave looks like, you're gonna go left or right and you're gonna move in that direction, ignoring what's going on in the other direction because you don't know. You didn't know, you can't see it, you're in a tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
I always compare instead dashboard and data visualization as a 3D map of the cave from outside. So you can see what the layout looks like, And you can tell that if you're going to go left, you're about to drop in a massive void and you're going to drop maybe like 500 feet. If you go to the right, you're actually going to enter a massive chamber and you're going to see the most amazing stalagmites and stalactites you've seen in your life.
Yeah.
For me, it's the mix of both that is quite essential, because walking in the cave is more exciting, is more human, is more interactive, and I can actually see things up close and get feedback and ask questions. But being able to have the map allows me to strategically point to specific hypotheses that I want to test about the data that I wouldn't be able to come up with if I didn't have the bird's eye view or that section view of the cave. Um,
Hmm.
and
Can I use that? Can I use that analogy in the future?
yeah, of course, yeah.
I will cite you as a source, so you get the credit for it. But
Does that make sense though? Does it work? Like if I'm telling you that, does it like do you go like,
it
oh yeah,
does. It does. I was literally envisioning myself walking down a cave and like coming to like a crossroads, and whether I go left or right, I'm going to ignore one area that could be very valuable. There could be like a gold mine on the right, and I could go off a cliff on the left. I think when you look at it from a helicopter perspective, right, where you're zoomed out, 3D visualization, I love what you said, being able to test hypotheses around around that. I think it's I'm interested to really see where the product is going, because I can almost envision, and I'm kind of imagining the narrative evolution, of Pulsar and how you're looking at it over time, how that, being able, like, you wouldn't necessarily be able to get those insights through on the cave, right? That is going to be something that you'd have to like,
yeah.
you know, get a 3D map of how and where, and who, right, is moving those narratives. So that's a very good explanation. I'm going to steal that.
Like if you think about it, you must have this experience all the time when you like exploring a topic with an LLM, and you go down a line of questioning and you get some answers, and then you go like, there was something that the LLM said 3 or 4 answers ago that is now like buried in the thread, and I want to go back to that and explore that again. And so that's almost like walking back on your steps, going back to the junction and going down the other junction, except that with the LLM, that creates a mess, because the LLM has now given you a view of your line of questioning that is gone down the specific path. It's not going
Yeah.
to undo that path. It's going to try and layer the new path that you now want to explore on top of the one that you've explored before. So it's going to get really confusing. And then the LLM also has the problem that the longer the context get, the more the LLM hallucinates. And that's something that Jeffrey Hinton
Yes.
has been like pushing really hard on, and like Jan Kuhn as well. It's like that LLMs are like flawed in the sense that like the longer that thread and that conversation and the context develops, the more errors you're gonna see in the outputs that you're generating. And that's by design. It's not by mistake. It's just the way the architecture works. And so I think I'm a big proponent of like new interfaces that would merge that chat view and that like abstraction, graphical, spatial view. And I think LLMs are going to evolve in that direction as well soon. But let's go back to narratives, because I think we're like hijacking that cave.
Yes, we are. We are.
Well, I almost hesitate to ask how the difference between media and social narratives fit into that analogy, Fran, because that's obviously something we spoke about in terms of like practical uses of this, like where you can see the media narratives are heading in one direction and the social narratives heading in another. Like, where does that kind of give, I guess, opportunity on the one hand and risk on the other to anyone trying to use this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the comparison of both, the reason why we structure the tool like that is that first of all, there's the strong beliefs in society right now that media diverges from public, and those are like very ideological views, but they have, like any ideology, a strong element of truth to it, which is that the media has an agenda, the public has a different agenda, and therefore the narratives don't necessarily correlate between the two. But the divergence of media versus public, or the convergence, tells you a lot about what's happening in society. So we left it separated. But for example, we're about to release blue sky data into narrative. So you'll be able to see anything from social media that's published on X, as well as the whole fires of blue sky within the same analysis. And we're not splitting them between X and blue sky. We're just leaving both of them within the social side of the narrative, the public side, because we want to show how those narratives are emerging. And maybe you'll see that some narratives emerge in blue skies and narratives emerge in X, and then they connect or they split up, but they tend to be very different from what you see in the media. Doesn't mean
Yeah.
that we won't change it at some point, but I think we want to keep the public signal and the media signal separate because they have different use cases, they come from different contexts, and they have different effects on people as well. We
Yeah,
thought,
the blue sky data is very rich. It's very there's high volume also. What's interesting about that is from a political landscape. I don't know how close you follow US politics, but
we can't avoid to follow US politics. It's basically every day. That's the politics.
yeah, I know. Um, I wish I could say the same about the UK politics. I only know a little bit from what I hear, and it's not a lot. So, but in general, when you look at X, Elon Musk is, the owner owns it. The majority of the discourse there is very right leaning. It's very conservative. And I think the rise of blue sky is because of that, right? And so I can't wait until you add blue sky because it's going to be interesting when looking up political types of discourse and language. It's going to be very evident, right, where there's left-leaning narratives, right-leaning narratives, and where those are coming from and how they're probably looking at the same issue, but totally different narratives erupting from that. It's fascinating to see that. I mean, I'm not a political strategist and I would never claim to be, but a lot of the work that I've done in the past several years is, looking at the political discourse and helping clients kind of see around corners, right? What is, and it's not always even about the brand. It's like, what are the issues in the world, whether it be tariffs or DE&I or sustainability or, the economy. What are the things that we as a brand need to be aware of? And I think narratives is an amazing use case for that. And so I'm excited to see that. When is that supposed to launch? And I won't hold it to you. I won't keep you, if you don't want to give a date, that's okay. But I'm very excited that that's coming.
So it's been live since last week. We haven't announced it yet. And the reason why
Oh,
we haven't announced it is that the narratives clustering happens on a daily basis. So you're going to start seeing more and more blue sky data in the data set as the narratives evolve over time. And you start seeing
great.
more content from blue sky being co-opted into existing narratives. And then you will start to see hopefully some new ones that are emerging that are completely led by blue sky. And you will see the sampled content representing the data sources that are making up the narrative. So you will get a sense of whether one is kind of like more X focused or blue sky focused. And
I see. So
what
you made the strategic decision to combine them into one data set. I'm just curious, what's the philosophy behind that? Because while I think that there are a lot of use cases for looking at social as one data set and then the media as a different data set, I wonder if there is value in looking at, at some point if when you add Reddit data or YouTube data or whatever data, TikTok data, like is there value from a narrative standpoint to isolate them by channel
well
or
the main thinking behind that is that narratives are cultural artifacts. There's this amazing quote by the science fiction writer of fantasy science fiction, Terry Pratchett. He said that people think that stories are shaped by people. In fact, it's the other way around. And
Hmm,
it's the other way around because stories do shape what people think. And that's why narratives have got this strong behavioral predictive power because they structure how people see the world, right? And in a world of kind of like media and social media, whatever someone believes becomes the structure of someone else's world because they're exposed to it. And this is why you have power laws, for example, in entertainment distribution, where we thought that the internet was gonna make people pay attention to a diverse range of content. Turns out, actually, with the internet and networks, people look more and more to the same content because they can see more people looking at the same content, and therefore they concentrate on specific items and titles of IP that make up the catalog of a media company. Just as an example, but the idea is that the narrative is that force that transcends cultures, languages, platforms. And so what you want is to identify that cultural seed that works in Nigeria as it works in London, as it works in India, as it works in the US. And it doesn't
hmm,
matter what happens on Blue Sky or on YouTube or on X, because it exists as a cultural seed that you need to pay attention to because there's a class of people in the world, different languages, different cultures that believe that thing. Now, it would be useful from a more tactical standpoint to understand if a narrative is stronger on Blue Sky versus YouTube versus X, because you do marketing in different platforms, you produce content in different platforms, and therefore you will probably find that information useful when you're doing platform-specific jobs. But that for me comes later. And at some point we might be able to, we might want to do that. We have the data to do that. But the first job we wanted to solve is, can I represent as many narratives that exist in people's minds today? And then I can kind of like work one layer down and see, now let me break it down by platforms to give people more tactical tools to do jobs for content marketing, for example, on those platforms. But the primary job was, I want to make sure that all the points of view that exist in society are represented by the tool. And that's why we decided that the next tool that I wanted to get was, the next platform was Blue Sky rather than any other platform, because it's so diametrically opposed to X. And
Yes.
yeah, and it gives you a really nice contrast. And that's why we wanted to get it in there.
That's amazing. Yeah, I need to get in. I did not realize Blue Sky data was integrated. I think we have some questions.
Yeah, yeah, I was about to say, I think we've had a couple of questions coming through while we've been talking. Someone's dropped one in just now saying, do narratives differ from one social media platform to another? And I think you answered some of that question there, Fran, but obviously we can expand upon it a bit more. But the other part of that question was, and are there any limitations to studying this? So yeah, I don't know what you guys think to that.
I'll just quickly on that, and I'll leave it to Michael. But yes, narratives differ by platform, but not because of the platform, because of the audience in those platforms. So you would see, for example, between Blue Sky and X, you know, the difference in narratives is because certain communities only exist in X and certain communities only exist in Blue Sky. A good example is that a lot of academics, for example, left X a couple of years ago, and they started being more active on Blue Sky. A lot of activists did the same. And so you would have narratives that are like in tune with those communities on Blue Sky, and you would have less of those narratives in X just because of the volume of people that from those communities are involved. And then in terms of the limitation, the biggest limitation we have on doing this job is that we need a fire hose of that content. So we need to have 100% of the content that exists within a platform to be able to give you scientific analysis of the narratives that exist within the platform. Because if we only were looking at a subset of the data, we would be misleading you. We would be telling you, like, you know, whatever we can get from the data and clustering it. And that's topic clustering, if you like, on a big scale. But what we're trying to say, out of 100% of the things that people say on X, or out of 100% of the things that people say in the news or in Blue Sky, these are the narratives and these are the relative weights between them. So that for us at the moment is the threshold. Wherever we can get 100% of the data, that goes into narratives, and that keeps the signal clear and the rankings scientific between the narratives.
No, that's an interesting question. You know, the reason why I asked about the channels is because sometimes, you know, clients want to know, like, where did this narrative evolve from, right? So you know, I think to your point, and that's the tactical question, right? It's okay, here are these narratives, right, from the data, but what started the narrative? Who was it, right? Was it an influencer? Was it a creator? And you know, I've, you know, we started doing more community-driven social listening recently. Not recently, but like for several years now, in, you know, partnership with like Audience, and you know, that platform, being able to identify groups of individuals and then listening to their conversations, from a monitoring perspective, and I see a lot of value in that. But to your point, though, it gives you a limited view, into the narratives at large if you're looking at just a core community or core group of people. But I think but I'm curious, you know, honestly, Fran, like, what is your view on that? Like, is it misleading to, or is it not? I guess it's still scientifically, you know, you can, from a statistical standpoint, it is, valid data, but you're also limited. If you're looking at 1,000 people or 100 political right-leaning creators and what they're saying, is there value in that?
It depends if you know the context of that subset. So if you know that 1,000 people represent 5% of the entire audience and in what corner of the audience they are, then that's really valuable. So what we normally do is we take, let's say, you're looking at people talking about sustainability, you break down the audience of sustainability in a number of like communities based on affinity or, how they're connected. And then you zoom in people that work in finance, because that's the segment that you want, right? You're doing government policy for around sustainability, and your target are the financial sector, and that's what's interesting to you. Now, obviously, you have a specific job to do, and you need insights and narratives from that specific subset of the audience, so that's really valuable. But you also want to know what part of the general population those people are, and you also want to know, is there overlap between them and other segments in the audience? So as long as you know who's around that specific community and what part of the overall audience they represent, then it's fine. Then, fantastic. But if you don't have that, that is a bit of a, stab in the dark, as in you can get some very interesting insights, but without the context, you don't know how important that community is.
Indeed, right, indeed. That makes sense. Okay. Yeah, I was just curious. I know that you have that integration in the core platform, right? Which is building audiences and social listening against those audiences. Is there ever, do you think there's ever a time where that kind of capability will be pulled into narratives?
Yeah, we're already discussing that.
Oh,
So right.
by September 17th, right? That's 2 weeks from now.
So at the moment we're getting a profile of the audience that he's behind the narrative. So we give you in the next release in a few days, you'll be able to see what is the type of people that gets involved in that kind of narrative. But you wouldn't get a segmentation yet. At some point, you
Mhm.
get a segmentation of the audience, and you'll be able to say, this narrative is mainly driven by, I don't know, MAGA supporters versus like tech startup people versus hedge funds managers in the States, right? At the moment, you get a description of like, yeah, it's this kind of person. This is where they lean politically. This is what they believe, and then we'll see if we need to get a breakdown. But I think that the decision on that audience segmentation and breakdown comes from how many outcomes can you map onto a narrative and how valuable it is to get that segmentation in relation to delivering those outcomes. So
Yeah.
as people get more sophisticated in how they use this, I think we'll build more functionality into the tools for analyzing the narratives.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I can talk about this all day. Should we just go another hour? I think people are having to jump though. I saw a comment.
I think that's like I can see 10 questions in there, so let's try and get through some of them.
Yeah, well, there's a great one that's come up here. So someone's saying, as a commercial semiotician, I'm naturally a fan of the term narratives. Just to clarify on sources, how do you define narratives beyond media discourse? I understand you're trying to keep this separate from public discourse, but is there a way to broaden their definition moving forward to encompass broader cultural stories and sources, e.g., cultural movements, fashion and art, etc.? These narratives massively shape people's beliefs, but are distinct from the media.
Hmm.
Yeah. Uh, we encountered that problem when building the product, and I'll give you my answer, but Michael will probably got his view on how he uses this. But we had a problem of defining narratives in multiple ways, and we landed on something that I think we're going to change at some point, because we landed on something that we now split into macro and micro narratives. So across the media and social, you can get two types of narratives: narratives that are like micro and narratives that are macro. The micro narratives tend to focus on beliefs that relate to more day-to-day events and things that are happening that people have a view on. And the macro narrative tend to be more long-term and tend to be focusing on bigger subjects like sustainability or climate change, things that you can see threads of that last for like years sometimes. Um, I we're exploring updating that taxonomy, which is not a taxonomy, actually, it's completely bottom up. We're exploring updating that lens on the data to provide something that is more flexible than that. But again, it depends on how people are using it. And that's why I wanted to start these conversations to just get like a sense of how people are using this and really try to adapt the product to use cases where we see most value, but there will be changes on that categorization. How about you, Michael? How do you look at narratives, like apart from like the obvious definition of a media narrative, when it comes to the public, what types of narratives from the public do you work with the most?
I think it's almost like one example I like to give is looking at like you mentioned sustainability, right? That's really not a narrative. That's just an issue.
Yeah,
That's there are sustainable brands. There are people who are advocacy groups around sustainability. But when we look at a narrative like sustainability, we want to understand, well, okay, well, what about sustainability do people care about? Because there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different things that people care about. And so I think that's where the narratives come in. Is it, net zero commitments? Is it deforestation? Is it EV and its effects on the and its effects on the ecosystem? Is it brands promising sustainability, making sustainability goals and not abiding by those promises? So I think that, to your point, I mean, it depends on context, right? Like who you work for and what it is you're looking to do. But I think, I don't really have a narrative definition that would be different from yours. But the way that I look at it is being able to peel the onion back to really understand the narratives that are driving behavior, and of course sustainability is one of them, but there are so many issues that are closer to people's
yeah, yeah.
values, that
You're
are
right.
important.
No, I'm not saying that sustainability is a narrative. I'm saying there's a type of narrative that exists within that specific theme that carries the beliefs that people have. I'll give you an example. Like when I really saw the power of this way of analyzing data was when I was looking at it was one of the first queries I ran on the product. And I ran a query on nuclear energy because I was interviewing someone for the podcast Audiences. By the way, check it out. Audiences podcast, very interesting. We interview people about the audiences of something. And when I was the subject was nuclear energy. So I simply put in nuclear energy within narratives. And the top narrative I got in the public was that nuclear energy is the cleanest source of energy. And I grew up in the 80s. And my dad used to take me to demonstrations against nuclear energy and the environmental movement. I didn't grow up with the idea that nuclear energy is the cleaner kind of energy. I know that in the
Is
last,
it?
well, that's the biggest narrative, and it's been the biggest narrative the last 5 years. Nuclear
Okay.
energy has become the cleanest way of producing energy, at least in perceptions and what people are saying. And the media is kind of like lining up behind that trend as well, but it didn't start from the media. So it's quite interesting for me to see how an expectation that I had, which is that people see nuclear energy still as something that is driving pollution, is carrying risk. Actually, the biggest narrative is that that's our best shot now at delivering the volume of energy that we need for all the crazy stuff that we're doing. And that was like, okay, this is amazing. I didn't know that the tide had shifted so
Mm-hmm.
much on a subject that I was so sure about, and I had no idea what number to put on this, but now I can. I know that X% of the narratives on nuclear energy are about how it's a clean source of energy. So that for me is quite revealing if you work in that space, for example, but even if you work in tech, because now you know that you can invest 10 billion on nuclear power plants if you Google, and people are not gonna get up in arms against you because there's a big narrative that is about how that's the cleanest kind of energy you can get.
That's a great use case. It's a great use case.
Mindful that we're about to go into like the last 5 minutes and the last question. So just before we do that, I just wanted to quickly say that everyone who signed up and attended today, we will be following up not only with the recording, but also with a free trial to Narratives, the tool that obviously Fran and Michael have been talking about for a week. So as Fran said, you guys can try it out for yourself and also let us know what you like what you think works. If there's anything you guys would like to see there as well. Like we're very open to hearing from that. But yeah, we'll be sending that email around in the days following this. So yeah, excited for you guys to try it for yourselves and put some of the stuff into practice. We did have room for that one last question before we bounce, and that was how can researchers distinguish between organic narratives and storytelling among social media users and narratives generated by ideologically driven or fake accounts? And how do these differ from traditional media coverage?
I want you to answer that, Fran, but but I was going to ask a question similar to this, which is it reminds me of a political campaign, right? I could be a politician and seed narratives in the marketplace, whether it's through fake accounts or through real people and my followers, you know, or people who believe what I believe. I think narrative is a great way to measure the effectiveness of that, right? Because you'll be able to see whether or not it's actually making a difference. I think that's an interesting use case. Of course, I would never say that creating fake accounts is a good thing to do, but if you have a movement of people and you want to change the narrative about something, you can if you're effective. And then I think the narratives can almost like validate whether or not you were successful in a sense. Do you agree, Fran? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think this is a problem that we've been looking into from the beginning, and there's two answers to that for me, at least based on how I've been thinking about this problem. The first one is that if there is uptake of a narrative, it kind of doesn't matter where you originated from. If it was originated by a bad agent or a bot, and the fact that people are talking about the narrative makes the narrative real by default, because it exposes it to other people and it creates that undercurrent that is gonna, it's gonna sweep some people in anyway, whether it's coming from something real or something manufactured. So if your use case is understanding where audience perceptions are at, it doesn't matter. If your use case is fighting misinformation, it definitely matters. And so what we do in that case, for example, is to look at, we do two things. One is we're introducing a score that analyzes the momentum that a narrative is achieving, and that momentum is based on calculating engagement, but also calculating the depth of the conversation, the breadth of the actors that get involved, and the type of actors that get involved in the conversation. So we can always tell you whether the narrative is originating from real, credible authors or not. Another thing that we're exploring is to look at a data set that exists within a partner called NewsGuard, and they have misinformation fingerprints, which are basically thousands of misinformation stories that exist that they've detected and validated, and then we create embeddings for these fingerprints, and then we match them to narratives, and we reveal when some of those fingerprints exist within the narratives that we're analyzing. So there's a couple of approaches. We'll see what works best. It's probably going to be a combination of both, but the starting point is that if the narrative has any kind of uptake, it's worth paying attention to it, whether you believe it's real or not, because we are in the age of spin. And so for me, the most important job that we have in the age of spin, when anything can be spun into any direction, is to quantifying what's happening to that spin and understanding how that spin started and where it's going next. And that's the best thing you can possibly do, trying to measure that spin. I guess that's what narrative is about, really, trying to measure how things are spinning today and by whom, and trying to see what it causes in terms of effects.
Wow.
And
Yeah,
that seems
perfect
like,
ending. That was perfect ending. We can
yeah.
stop the video now. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a great enlightening conversation, Fran.
We could go on for hours, Michael. Thank you so much for doing this. Appreciate it. And keep giving us the amazing feedback. We love it. And I haven't done dark mode yet, but we'll make sure to prioritize it next.
Dark mode.
Still,
Awesome.
I know you want it.
I
know
do.
you want
I do. It just looks better.
it.
All right, brilliant. Well, thank you again, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Michael and Fran. And yeah, watch out for those emails, and we'll be in touch shortly. So cheers. Have a great evening, great day, depending where you are.
Thank you.